I'm Melissa Case from Hat to Hem, and today we are finally at the end of the Making Mina series. All of the videos in this series are in the description, and they will also be in the playlist at the end of the video, just in case you missed any. So today, to finish up the whole series, I am going to show you how I made the hat for the Mina commission. This hat is based off of one worn by Winona Ryder in a 1992 gothic horror film, Bram Stoker's Dracula. It was designed by Iko Ishioka, who won an Academy Award for the costume she designed for this film. Now, originally my client only commissioned a dress. I think she was a little surprised when I offered to also make the hat, but I'm really glad I did. I think it would be a poor showing to say I can dress you from hat to hem and then not really have anything to back that claim. Anyway, I should probably talk about the hat now. The hat is a fairly tall late bustle hat. It had a brim with a bound edge going slightly up at the sides. It's trimmed with a pleated bit of fabric with a knot at the end and two tails, though I only did one because I only saw one in my reference pictures. I think the pleated bit was to invoke the leaf theme that she has going on in some of her costumes. We weren't too sure about the colors, so my client decided that we should do the main hat in the same fabric as the gown, and the trim in the fabric that lines the waterfall back of her gown. For this hat, I used Truly Victorian's TV 550 1880s buckram hat frame pattern. Whew, that was a mouthful. It's a very easy pattern to use. I actually made my first hat ever using this pattern. I've used it 3 or 4 times and I would highly recommend it. It comes in a few different sizes and it's a very versatile pattern. This particular hat is using the extra tall size, the same size I used for the hat I made for my blue and gold steampunk gown. As you can see, the buckram pieces are a lot smaller than the fabric pieces. You'll see how this works soon, though I'm pretty sure you can guess. Am I making it too obvious? All my buckram pieces were traced and cut out with all the marks transferred in simple pencil. This hat is just 3 main pieces: the brim, the crown, and the tip. I have millinery wire on hand to straighten those pieces. Bias crinoline tape will help smooth out the edges of the hat, and the flannel I cut out from the buckram pieces will smooth out the rest of the hat. First, I very carefully sewed the wire to the buckram pieces by machine using a zigzag stitch. You can do this by hand, but I find doing it by machine is just a little bit easier. If not easier, it's quicker. I added the wire all around the circumference of the tip and the brim, as well as along the bottom of the crown. I also added a few vertical pieces for extra support. I overlapped the crown to the line I transferred from the pattern. Then I put the crown on the brim and adjusted the bottom to match a different line I transferred from the pattern. I then adjusted the top to match the tip. Whoops, too wide. Once the top and the bottom were the right widths, I secured the overlapping edges by hand. Using a curved needle, I attached the tip to the crown. You don't need to use a curved needle for this though, a normal one works just as well. I glued a strip of the bias crinoline tape to smooth out the rough edge. I did the same thing around the edge of the brim. Now for those flannel pieces. I glued down the tip first, making sure the fabric is smoothed out. The crown takes a little bit more finessing. I matched the crown and the flannel center to center, and then I smoothed the flannel around the crown to the back, using my clips to keep it in place. I trim off the extra bit and butt the 2 edges against each other. It took a few times to get this right. I glued the top of the flannel to the crown, again, starting from the center and working my way to the back. The center back edges and the edge along the bottom of the crown were secured with glue and left to dry. Now, adding flannel to the brim is a completely different experience from adding it to the crown. First, I smoothed out 1 layer of flannel on the side of the brim that I didn't transfer the pattern markings, and I clipped it in place. Then I took it over to my sewing machine and stitched over the line that I drew that's closest to the edge of the brim. Once that's done, I carefully cut out the center of the buckram and the flannel around the second line that I transferred from the pattern. I secured the edge of the flannel by carefully stitching around the edge of the brim. Then I flipped the brim over and repeated everything on the other side. I know the brim needs to angle upward, so I gently bent it into shape before stitching down the outside edge of the second piece of flannel. Then everything gets repeated again with the fashion fabric up until stitching the edge down. Instead of stitching by machine, I do it by hand, tacking the edge of the underside to the brim. The type of stitch really doesn't matter here since it won't be seen anyway. Back in my machine, I stitched on the edge binding to the brim right sides together. Then I flipped the brim over, clipped the fashion fabric to the uncover side, and then I flipped it over again to stitch it on. I cut off the extra fabric, and then I turned my binding over the edge and clipped it in place, hiding any visible stitching. I feel like this part of the process is just constantly clipping and flipping. The binding was then slip stitched in place. Might as well cover the rest of the hat while I'm at it. The fastened fabric for the tip is smoothed over the crown and basted in place. I made a few snips into the allowance to help it lie flat. For the rest of the crown, I start in the center front like I did with the flannel, and I smooth it to the back so I have an idea of where everything will lie. I folded the seam allowance under the edge of the crown and clipped it in place. Then I tucked away the seam allowance along the top so it was level with the tip, and I pinned it in place until I could secure it with a slip stitch. I slip stitched the back seam allowance and I prick stitched the bottom. Now that everything is covered, we can actually start working on attaching the brim to the crown. First, I trimmed into the seam allowance on the brim, careful not to cut too close to my stitching. I bent the seam allowance upward into where the crown will be. And I attached the crown to the brim by prick stitching through the seam allowance tabs. Alright, time for trim! Right sides together, I stitched the bottom edge of my trim fabric to the bottom of the crown. I manipulated the fabric into the pleats I wanted and I pinned them into place until I could slip stitch them down. A lot of slip stitching happens with this project. I overlapped the edges at the front of the hat and tucked the raw edge under. This will be hidden by the pleated leaf trim. Speaking of which, drafting the leaf trim was pretty straightforward. I pleated a piece of paper until it's the length I needed, and I cut out the width I wanted. I used this to cut out my fashion fabric. I sewed the fabric into a tube and turned it inside out. I used my ballpoint bodkin to make the points nice and neat. Then I whip stitched the bottom hem. I folded up the fabric and checked it against the hat before stitching it down the center to keep it in place. I folded the tail, bringing back memories of all of my origami attempts in grade school, and I gave it a press. However, I'm not securing it yet. This is just to be a guide for later. I sewed a small strip of bias tape made out of the main dress fabric down the center of the leaf. I took a little more of that bias tape and I made a tube. I used tweezers to get it onto the pleated leaf trim, and now it's ready to be sewn to the hat. I attached trim along the center up to that little bias tube, leaving the tail bit free. Then I secured the length of the bottom to the hat. All that's left is the lining. I cut the tip and the crown pieces out of the dress fabric. The tip is slightly smaller than the one that I used for the hat. I sewed a straight stitch a ½ inch from the top and bottom edges before turning the crown piece into a tube. I cut into my seam allowance to my row of stitching. I clipped the top edge to the tip and I stitched it down. The last step is to attach the lining to the hat. I pinned it in place and, you guessed it, slip stitched it down. Here's a little bonus. Whenever I have a hat commission, I always try to make a custom hat pin that matches the hat that I made. And that's it! Oh my goodness, we're actually done! I can finally start posting other videos now. Oh, I did post a Secret Santa video and the year in review video, so I guess I've been posting other videos anyway. Anyway, thank you so much for following me along on this journey. I had so much fun making this gown and the hat, and sharing all of that progress with you. I hope you were able to enjoy this series. If you did, please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear from you. If you're interested in what I have coming up, and I do have a lot coming up this year, feel free to hit that subscribe button. I think there's a little bell that you can click on in order to get notifications when I post a video. I don't know exactly how it works. Feel free to follow me on Facebook or Instagram. I do post progress pictures fairly often, except for my current commission, although I am filming my progress for that, so those videos will be up as soon as my client announces what she's cosplaying. Does saying it's a cosplay kind of give it away? No, I guess not. I guess it still is fine. Anyway, I'll see you in 2 weeks with another video. Bye! By the way, if you're interested in trying your own hand at hat making, Jennifer Rosberg over at Historical Sewing has an excellent hat making class that I'll post in the description. I know I explain what I do in this video, but it's really no substitute for her in-depth guidance. For the record, this video is not sponsored by Historical Sewing. I just think that her classes are fantastic.